A poor farmer about to lose everything finds by accident the entrance to a mysterious cave right on his land. He had no idea what was hidden inside and how this find would change his life forever. Subscribe and write in the comments the city you are watching from. The morning light came slowly over the worn fields of the Hardy farm, stretching across the uneven rows of soil that had once been fertile but now lay gray and tired. Thomas Hardy stood on his porch, shoulders hunched, gazing at the horizon as if searching for something that was no longer there. The air was sharp, filled with the dry smell of dust and old wood, and every sound carried too far, as though the land itself wanted to remind him how empty it had become. The crows had taken to perching on the split-rail fences, watching him with cold black eyes, as though they sensed the weakness of a man who could no longer fight against time and fate. For more than 50 years, this place had been his world. His grandfather had carved it out of the wild. His father had endured droughts and storms to keep it alive, and now it had passed to Thomas, who had done everything he could to protect it, only to watch it fall apart inch by inch. The barn, once a proud red, had faded to a dull brown, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The tractor, which had once been the heart of the farm, sat rusting in the yard, its engine beyond repair, its tires cracked. Even the soil beneath his boots seemed to groan with tiredness when he walked across it. The bank's letter lay inside on the kitchen table, but he didn't need to see it again. He knew the words by heart. 3 weeks left. Either pay what he owed in full or see everything auctioned off to the highest bidder. Thomas had lived long enough to understand the math of despair. He had sold off the cattle last season, then the chickens, then the horses. Piece by piece, the life of the farm had been taken apart. What remained was a shell, a man alone with empty fields and unpaid debts. He walked slowly down the steps and across the yard. The fence posts leaned, the gates hung crooked. He had mended them so many times that the patches were older than the original wood, but there was no point in repairing anything anymore. A farm with no animals did not need fences. He pushed open the gate anyway, out of habit, and looked across the barren land. Once these fields had produced corn so tall that it seemed to scrape the sky, wheat that glowed golden under the summer sun. Now they were thin patches of weeds spotted with stones, as though the earth had decided it had given enough and would give no more. Thomas's hands were rough, the skin thick and scarred from decades of work, yet they trembled slightly as he held them up to the light. He remembered his father's hands, strong and steady even in old age, guiding his own boyish grip on a plow, teaching him the rhythm of work, the patience of the land. That memory struck like a knife. He had carried on the legacy, but the world had changed. Machines grew larger, farms merged into vast companies, and men like him, men who thought loyalty to the soil was enough, had been left behind. Inside the house, the air was stale with the smell of wood smoke and dust. The letter lay where he had left it, the red ink screaming against the yellowed paper. Final notice. He crumpled it once more in his hands, then smoothed it out and set it aside. He could not destroy it, because to destroy it would be to admit that it had power. But he could not ignore it either. It was a death sentence written in numbers. At night, sleep offered no peace. He dreamed of walking through the farmhouse, but in his dreams, the rooms were empty, stripped bare, voices whispering in the walls. He heard his grandfather's voice, then his father's chastising him, telling him he had failed. In those dreams, he reached for the soil, and it slipped through his fingers like ash. He woke sweating, his chest tight, staring into the darkness as if it held answers he could not see. But every morning he rose again. There was nothing else to do. Even if the farm no longer produced, even if his debts grew heavier, he could not simply sit and wait for the end. He patched fences that no longer needed patching. He checked the old well. He trimmed weeds around the house. Small tasks, meaningless perhaps, but they gave him a reason to move, to fight against the slow collapse. He knew that one day soon the bank men would arrive, papers in hand, ready to take what was left. Until that day, he would work as though the land were still his. The loneliness pressed hardest in the evenings. When the sun dropped behind the horizon and the fields turned to shadows, the silence became unbearable. Once this house had been filled with laughter, the clatter of dishes, the voices of family. Now the only sound was the wind moaning through the cracks in the walls. He would sit by the stove, staring into the flames, his thoughts circling endlessly. There had to be some way to save it, some last chance hidden in the folds of fate. Yet each time he tried to imagine it, he came up against the same wall. Money he did not have, time that was running out. He had thought once of selling his father's rifle, an old piece with a worn stock, but the price it would fetch was barely enough to buy a week's worth of food. He had considered looking for work on neighboring farms, but there was no work to be had. The season was slow, and men younger than him were already waiting for jobs. Each possibility led nowhere. That morning, as he stood on the porch, the frost crunching under his boots, he tried to breathe in the chill air as if it could give him strength. The land stretched before him, tired, but still beautiful in its own way, the sky pale and clear above it. He thought of his father's words. The land gives back to those who give to it. Thomas had given everything. Perhaps the land had nothing left to give. Yet even in that despair, some part of him clung to hope. Not hope of money or miracles, but the stubborn hope of a man who refuses to lay down and die. He would keep walking the fields, keep mending what he could, keep rising with the sun. He would fight until the last day because that was the only way he knew how to live. And so the final days of the farm began to unfold, each one a mirror of the last, each one carrying him closer to the inevitable. What he could not yet know as he turned back toward the house and the waiting silence was that fate had already shifted, that the land had one last secret buried deep within it. The storm that would reveal it was gathering just beyond the horizon. And the quiet despair of Thomas Hardy's life was about to collide with something far older, far stronger than debt or failure. The storm arrived in the night with a violence that shook the timbers of the farmhouse and rattled the glass in the window panes. Rain slashed across the roof like handfuls of gravel, and the wind roared down from the hills, bending the skeletal trees until they creaked in protest. Thomas lay awake in his narrow bed, listening as the heavens seemed to break themselves open over his land. He knew storms well enough to sense their weight and danger. But this one felt different, more insistent, as if the sky itself was trying to tear away what little remained of his world. By morning, the air smelled of wet earth and split wood, and the farmyard was littered with branches and torn shingles. He rose stiffly, his body aching, as it always did after nights without sleep, and went outside to survey the damage. The chicken coop had lost part of its roof, though it hardly mattered anymore. The coop empty now, but for cobwebs. The fence on the northern edge leaned drunkenly, where the post had loosened in the soaked ground. Yet it was not the yard that drew his eye, but the distant ridge beyond the fallow field, where the land dipped into an old ravine. He saw at once that the hillside looked altered, as if the storm had taken a bite out of the earth. From where he stood, it was only a dark smudge, a strange wound in the rock, but something about it held his gaze. By midday, the rain had stopped. Though the ground still oozed with water beneath his boots, Thomas made his way toward the ravine, drawn by an unease he could not quite name. The soil was soft, treacherous, sliding underfoot as he descended into the narrow gully. Here the storm had carved new scars, washing away layers of clay and stone that had been buried for decades, maybe longer. And there, at the base of the cliff, he saw what had caught his eye from the house. A jagged opening where none had been before, a hollow mouth in the rock, black and uninviting. He stood before it for a long time, rain dripping from the overhang above, his breath clouding in the chill. The opening was not wide, just enough for a man to stoop and pass inside, but it carried with it the weight of mystery. He felt the cold draft that breathed from it, damp and old, carrying with it the smell of stone and something else he could not place, something metallic and faintly sour. The storm had revealed a secret, and Thomas's first instinct was caution. The land was full of hidden dangers. He had lived through sinkholes that swallowed barns, wells that ran dry or turned bitter, caves that collapsed under their own forgotten weight. To step inside without thought could mean injury or worse, and there was no one to call for help if the earth closed in on him. Yet he found himself leaning forward, peering into the gloom. He thought of his father and grandfather, both men who had walked these same acres, and wondered if they had ever guessed what lay hidden beneath. All morning, he argued with himself in silence. He had no business poking into caves when there were still fences to mend and gutters to clear. Yet the pull of that dark space was relentless. He could not shake the sense that it had been waiting, concealed until the storm stripped away its covering. Perhaps it was nothing but a pocket in the rock, a shallow den for animals. Perhaps it was deeper, a forgotten cavern. Or perhaps, though he dared not name the thought, it was something meant for him to find, a last offering from the land he loved, even as it betrayed him. By afternoon he could resist no longer. He returned to the house and gathered what tools he could trust. The old lantern with its soot-blackened glass, a length of rope that had frayed from years of use, and a pick left over from more hopeful times. With these in hand, he made his way back to the ravine, the weight of his decision pressing as heavily as the tools themselves. The mouth of the cave yawned before him, silent and unwelcoming. He lit the lantern, shielding the flame with his hand until it caught, and bent to enter. The first step inside chilled him to the bone. The air was different here, heavy with moisture, thick with the smell of earth that had been sealed away from the sun. His boots scraped against stone, the sound magnified until it seemed to echo forever. At first, the passage was narrow, forcing him to hunch low, the walls close enough to brush his shoulders. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow rhythms, forming puddles that gleamed in the lantern light. But as he moved deeper, the space widened, and he saw signs that made him pause. There were blackened patches along the stone floor, the remnants of old fires long since cooled. A few feet beyond lay a broken length of timber charred at one end, its surface scarred by a blade. These were not the works of nature. Thomas knelt to touch the wood, the grains softened by time, yet unmistakably shaped by human hands. Someone had been here before, long ago. The thought sent a tremor through him. His land, which he had believed to be only soil and rock, had harbored a secret history all along. He raised the lantern higher, casting its light along the rough walls. There were faint marks cut into the stone, deliberate strokes that might have been symbols or merely tallies. The sight of them filled him with both dread and wonder. He pressed on, each step an act of will against the growing unease that gripped him. The tunnel curved, the air tightening, and for a moment he considered turning back. But then he remembered the letter on his table, the red ink spelling doom, and he knew that retreat would only return him to despair. Here, at least, was a mystery, and mystery carried with it the possibility of change. When at last he emerged into a small chamber, his breath caught. The ceiling rose high above, jagged with stalactites that gleamed like teeth in the lantern's glow. The floor was uneven, scattered with stones and debris. But in the center lay another relic of human presence, a ring of rocks blackened by fire, with ashes still clinging stubbornly between them. Time had all but erased the evidence, yet not completely. Someone had sheltered here once in the depths of this hidden place. He crouched beside the fire ring, running his fingers through the ashes, and felt the fragile remnants crumble to dust. Whoever had kindled this fire had been gone for decades, perhaps longer. Yet the knowledge that another soul had walked here before him filled him with a strange kinship. He was not the first, but perhaps he was meant to be the next. The lantern sputtered, and he adjusted the wick, casting nervous glances into the shadows that pressed in on all sides. He had gone far enough for one day. His curiosity was sharp, but so was his caution. There was no telling how deep the cave ran, what dangers might lurk farther in. Still, as he retraced his steps toward the entrance, he could not escape the feeling that he was leaving something important behind. When at last he stepped out into the gray light of dusk, the wind on his face felt like a blessing. He turned to look back once more at the dark mouth of the earth. It waited there, silent and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. Thomas knew he would return. He could no more resist the call of that hidden place than he could stop the seasons from turning. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt a flicker of anticipation, a stirring of purpose. The cave had been revealed for a reason, and though he did not yet understand it, he intended to find out. As night fell over the weary farm, the letter still lay on the kitchen table, its threat unchanged. But Thomas's eyes no longer lingered on it with the same despair. Something had shifted. The land had spoken in the language of stone and storm, opening a path into the unknown. Whatever lay waiting in the darkness beneath his feet, it was his to uncover, and in that thought there was a fragile spark of hope. The days that followed the storm carried with them a new rhythm, though the outward life of the farm had changed very little. Thomas still rose before dawn, still walked the perimeter of his fields, still touched the fences with the same calloused hands that had mended them 100 times before. Yet in his mind there lingered a weight, a secret he could not ignore. The cave had lodged itself in his thoughts like a thorn beneath the skin, and everything he did was colored by the memory of its dark mouth and the faint signs of human presence within. The letter on the kitchen table remained, but when he looked at it now, he did not feel only despair. For the first time, there was something else beneath the despair, something that resembled a question. On the third morning after the storm, he decided he could no longer content himself with half measures. He gathered provisions with a deliberation that betrayed both fear and determination. The lantern, newly filled with oil, a length of sturdy rope, tested twice for strength. His father's pickaxe heavy in his hands, though its balance felt oddly comforting. He filled a flask with water from the well and took a packet of dried meat from the cupboard. When he had finished, he stood for a long while in the center of his kitchen, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Its steady rhythm reminded him of a heartbeat, marking the moments of a life that had not yet ended. The sun had just cleared the horizon when he set out. The ravine looked as it had before, raw and unsettled. The rocks stained darker where water had scoured them clean. The mouth of the cave yawned in the shadow of the cliff, unchanged, patient as ever. As Thomas approached, his breath quickened. He did not want to be afraid, but fear had its claws in him, and only resolve could carry him forward. He struck a match, lit the lantern, and bent low to enter. The cave received him with silence. His boots crunched against the loose gravel, and the echo came back to him in distorted shapes, as if the earth itself were listening. He passed again the charred timber and the remnants of ash where someone had once kept fire. This time he studied them longer, tracing the grain of the wood, the blackened fragments that crumbled at his touch. The knowledge that another had been here before him both unsettled and steadied him. He was not the first, and that gave his journey a sense of continuity, as though he were walking in another's footsteps. Deeper in, the tunnel widened, and he noticed things he had missed before. There were scratches on the walls, deliberate lines etched with a tool rather than shaped by nature. Some were little more than tallies, strokes grouped together in fives, but others formed symbols, crude yet purposeful. He held the lantern close, studying them, and though he could not read their meaning, he knew they had been left by human hands marking a path. The thought made his skin prickle. This was not merely a cave. It had been used, worked, perhaps even lived in. As he pressed on, the air grew cooler, thicker. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop falling with a hollow plink into small pools that glimmered in the light. The floor underfoot became uneven, stones scattered among patches of hardened clay. Here and there he saw remnants of timber bracing the walls rotted nearly to dust. His lantern cast long, uncertain shadows, and in the flickering glow he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The remains of narrow rails half buried in debris, stretching forward into the darkness. They were rusted, twisted, nearly consumed by the earth, but unmistakable. Thomas knelt to touch them. The cold iron under his fingers was the strongest proof yet. This had been a tunnel for mining. Men had cut into this mountain, driven carts along these rails, hauled something out into the world. He could almost hear them in his mind. The clatter of wheels, the ring of pickaxes, the heavy breathing of men laboring in the dark. The air seemed to hold their echoes, faint but insistent. He found himself whispering aloud without meaning to. A simple question that had no answer. What did you leave behind? As he followed the rails deeper, the marks of labor became clearer. He saw holes in the walls where iron spikes had once been driven, their stubs protruding like broken teeth. He found the handle of a shattered shovel, the wood soft with rot, but still shaped by the grip of a human hand. Every discovery drew him further in, despite the gnawing tension in his stomach. He knew caves could be dangerous, that collapses claim lives quickly and without warning. But the compulsion to keep going was stronger than caution. He was not just wandering into the unknown. He was retracing the steps of those who had come before. The tunnel bent sharply, and with it came a change in the air. It grew heavier, close with a smell that was not only earth and stone, but something sharper, metallic. His lantern flared against the damp walls, and he saw stains there, dark streaks where water had once trickled. He could almost believe that the rock itself bled history. He set his jaw and pressed on, each step slower, more deliberate. At last, the tunnel opened again into a small chamber, larger than the one he had seen before. The floor was littered with broken planks, the remains of what might have been crates or supports. In one corner, he saw the collapsed frame of a wagon, its iron fittings rusted but still intact. He lifted the lantern high, casting light over the space, and for the first time he saw clearly the marks left behind by men desperate to claim the Earth's secrets. The walls bore the scars of picks, deep grooves where veins of stone had been hacked away. It was a room carved by ambition, not by nature. Thomas stood in the center, breathing heavily, and let the reality of it wash over him. The stories his father had told him as a boy returned in fragments, half-remembered whispers about men who had come to this land searching for gold, about companies that rose and vanished in the shadows of the mountains. He had dismissed them as tales meant to entertain children. But here, before his eyes, was proof. His family's farm stood atop a past that had been hidden, a past that might still hold answers or wealth or ruin. For a long time he did not move. He only listened to the cave, to the faint creaks of the stone, to the drip of unseen water. The silence pressed against him, yet within it there was a strange clarity. His life above ground was failing, each day dragging him closer to loss. Down here, however, there was possibility. Possibility of danger, yes, but also of salvation. When at last he turned to leave, his lantern throwing trembling arcs of light, he felt both drained and alive. The cave had taken something from him, and it had given something back. His legs ached, his hands trembled, but his heart beat with a steady insistence. He had glimpsed enough to know that he could not abandon this path. Emerging once more into the fading light of evening, he looked back at the dark opening. It no longer seemed merely a wound in the earth. It was a doorway, a threshold between the despair of his life above and the mysteries that lay beneath. He touched the rock beside the entrance as though sealing a pact. He would return. He would uncover what the men of the past had sought to hide or to protect. He would find out whether the cave held ruin or redemption. The farm lay quiet as he walked back across the fields. But for the first time in months, the silence did not feel like the silence of defeat. It felt instead like the hush before revelation, a pause in which the world held its breath. Thomas knew that his own breath had changed. It came faster, heavier, but steadier, as if the cave had breathed something into him. He no longer saw only dead soil and broken fences. Somewhere beneath his feet, hidden in darkness, there was more. And that knowledge, fragile though it was, kept his steps from faltering as he returned to the waiting house and the long night ahead. The following days became a blur of labor that felt both familiar and entirely new. Thomas was no stranger to hard work. His life had been built on it, but this was different from plowing fields or mending fences. Each morning he rose with the first light, ate quickly, and carried his lantern and tools down to the ravine. The farm still stood silent and hungry above, but his mind no longer lingered on its emptiness. Every thought, every heartbeat was fixed on what lay beneath the earth. Inside the cave, he moved with growing confidence, following the rails deeper, clearing away loose stones and dirt where the passage had narrowed. The air was damp and heavy, the silence broken only by the scrape of his pickaxe and the drip of unseen water. Sweat soaked his shirt even in the chill. His hands blistered until they bled. But he pressed on. Something about the rhythm of digging steadied him. Every swing of the pick seemed to bring him closer to an answer, as though he were digging not only through stone, but through the despair that had gripped him for so long. He began to notice how the cave had its own moods. Some mornings it welcomed him, the air strangely still, the lantern's glow steady and bright. Other times it felt hostile, the stone groaning in its depths, shadows crowding close until his heart pounded with the fear of collapse. He learned to listen, to pause when the earth seemed restless, to move slowly when his instincts whispered caution. The cave was not his enemy, but neither was it his ally. It was something older, indifferent, and he had to earn his place within it. On the seventh day of work, his pick struck something that rang. With a sound unlike stone, he froze, the echo reverberating along the tunnel like a bell tolling in the distance. Carefully, he cleared away the soil and rock, and there, beneath the layers of time, he saw the dull gleam of metal. His breath caught. He scraped faster, hands clawing at the dirt until more of it was revealed. A surface flat and unyielding, iron-bound, the corner of a chest or box. His pulse hammered as he worked, the lantern's light trembling with his movements. At last, he uncovered enough to see it clearly. A strong box, its edges reinforced with iron, the surface scarred, but intact. The lock was corroded, but still held its shape. He ran his fingers over it, half expecting it to vanish, to dissolve like a dream. But it was real, cold, solid, heavy with promise. For a long time, he simply knelt there in the silence, the weight of discovery pressing on him as much as the box itself. When he finally pried the lock with his pickaxe, the sound of metal giving way was sharper than any he had heard in years. A crack that seemed to split not only the lock, but the course of his life. He lifted the lid with trembling hands. The lantern light fell across rows of shapes that glowed dully in the darkness. Gold, bars of it, coins wrapped in cloth that had yellowed with age, their surfaces still gleaming where the fabric had fallen away. There were stacks of documents as well, bound together with twine, their edges brittle but legible. Thomas lifted one of the bars, its weight staggering in his hand. He had never held so much wealth in his life. Each coin, each bar was worth more than his farm had been in years, perhaps more than the entire valley. He set it down quickly, afraid that the earth itself might notice his trespass and close in upon him. His hands shook as he opened the packet of papers. The ink had faded, but the words remained. Ledgers of a mining company, records of shipments, maps showing tunnels that spread beneath the hills. The story came into focus as he read. Men had dug here generations ago, found riches beyond measure. But something had forced them to abandon it. The documents did not say why, only that wealth had been hidden, secured against return. He sat back on his heels, the chest open before him, and for the first time in years he felt the burden of despair lift. This was enough to save the farm, enough to pay every debt, to rebuild, perhaps even to dream again. Yet, even as hope surged in him, another feeling pressed close. Dread. The cave had not given up its secret easily, and secrets like these were not meant to remain hidden forever. When he left the cave that evening, the chest wrapped in canvas and hidden beneath brush near the ravine, he felt a strange lightness. His boots sank into the soft soil as he climbed back toward the house, but his heart rose higher than it had in decades. The farm looked different in the twilight. The broken fences, the leaning barn, they no longer seemed like symbols of failure, but like challenges he could overcome. He would restore it. He would honor the memory of his father and grandfather. He would live again, but hope did not come alone. The next morning, as he walked into town to purchase supplies, he noticed the way people looked at him. Their eyes lingered longer than usual, their conversations hushed as he passed. A man nodded politely, but there was curiosity in his gaze, as though he knew something had changed. News traveled fast in small places, faster than truth, faster than caution. He realized with a chill that someone might already suspect. That evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Thomas stood on his porch and thought he saw a figure at the edge of his land. It vanished into the trees before he could be certain, but the feeling remained. He was not alone. Someone had noticed his comings and goings, perhaps even followed him to the ravine. The gold had saved him, but it had also painted a target on his back. In the days that followed, strangers began to linger near the farm. Men who asked too many questions in town. A pair of riders seen more than once on the ridge above his fields. The world that had seemed so empty was suddenly filled with watchful eyes. Thomas felt the old fear return, heavier now because it was sharpened by greed. He locked the doors at night, something he had never done before. He slept fitfully, waking at every creak, every rustle of wind against the shutters. Still, he returned to the cave. He could not stay away. The documents promised more than gold. They spoke of untapped veins, of riches still hidden. The thought of it was intoxicating. Yet each time he stepped into the darkness, he carried with him the memory of that shadow at the edge of his land. He worked more quickly now, his hands trembling with both urgency and dread. The cave had given him salvation, but it had also summoned danger. He could feel it in the way the silence pressed tighter, in the way the lantern's flame seemed more fragile. One night, as he finished covering the chest with brush after another secret visit, he heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats on the road. He froze, crouched in the shadows, listening. The horses drew nearer, their steps deliberate, unhurried. Then they stopped. He could hear the murmur of voices too low to make out, the metallic jingle of bridles. His heart hammered as he pressed himself deeper into the darkness. After a long moment, the riders moved on, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. Thomas did not move until the night was utterly still again. When he finally rose and made his way back to the farmhouse, the fear clung to him as tightly as his sweat-soaked shirt. The cave had changed everything. It had given him hope, but it had also awakened the hunger of others. The gold was no longer safe, and neither was he. Standing at the window, watching the fields under the cold light of the moon, he realized the truth. His discovery was not just a treasure. It was a summons. The past had reached into the present, and with it came all the dangers of men's greed. His life was no longer his own, not in the way it had been before. He had entered into a struggle far larger than debts and failing soil. And though he was weary and afraid, he knew there was no turning back. The cave had chosen him, and he would have to face whatever came next. The nights grew heavier after the discovery, filled with the weight of gold hidden beneath brush and stone, and with the knowledge that eyes now watched him from the shadows of the trees. Thomas felt it in every rustle of leaves, every creak of the porch boards, every distant crack of a branch. The farm that had once seemed lonely and abandoned no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with unseen presence. He tried to sleep, but dreams turned restless, twisting between the memory of holding gold in his hand and the fear of hands reaching out to take it from him. He knew as surely as he knew the seasons that men would come. Wealth drew them, like carrion drew vultures. It did not take long. The first confrontation came at dusk when 3 men appeared at the end of his drive. Their horses restless, as though even the animals sensed the tension that hung in the air. They called out in voices meant to sound friendly, but Thomas saw the hardness in their eyes. They said they had heard stories, that old mines had been found in the hills, that perhaps he had stumbled upon something while tending his land. Their words dripped with casual suggestion, but their hands lingered near their belts where pistols gleamed in the fading light. Thomas told them there was nothing but rock and dirt on his property, that he had no time for ghost tales. They laughed as if they did not believe him, and when they rode away, their laughter echoed long after they had gone, leaving behind a silence that felt like a promise of return. Thomas sat on his porch long into the night, the rifle across his knees, though it had not been fired in years. He thought of his father, of the stories of hard men who had fought for less than gold. He thought, too, of the documents lying beneath the floorboards in his kitchen, carefully hidden away. They were more precious than the coins themselves, for they carried the proof of ownership, the key to making his claim known before the law. Gold could be stolen, but records properly delivered could establish rights that no thief could erase. It was then he understood that his struggle would not be only against greed in the shadows, but also for recognition in the open daylight of courts and offices. He resolved to take the papers into town to place them in the hands of someone who could protect what they meant. It was not an easy decision. To expose the documents was to expose himself, but to keep them hidden was to risk losing everything if stronger men forced their way onto his land. The morning he set out, he felt as though he were carrying not only his own fate, but the weight of generations. The road stretched empty before him, yet he could not shake the feeling of being followed. Every bend in the path seemed to hide watchful eyes. Every sound of hoof or wheel in the distance made his heart quicken. At the courthouse, he met with a lawyer whose name had long been respected in the county. The man examined the records with a frown that deepened into surprise. He said the documents were old, but genuine, stamped with the seal of a company that had once operated in these hills. More importantly, they contained maps and ledgers that detailed not only what had been taken, but what remained. If Thomas pursued it, the lawyer explained, he could establish a legal claim to the land beneath his farm and to the mineral rights it contained. It would be a battle, long and costly, but it was winnable. Thomas listened in silence, the words heavy with promise and peril alike. When he returned home that evening, he found the gate broken, the barn door ajar. Inside, nothing had been taken. There was little worth stealing, but the message was clear. Someone had been there searching, leaving behind the stench of intrusion. He tightened the hidden place where the gold lay, checking the brush more carefully, but he knew that secrecy alone would not be enough. He was already marked. The next confrontation came not from strangers, but from men whose families had once worked the mines generations ago. They arrived with bitter words, saying the treasure beneath the hills was their inheritance, stolen by the company that had buried it. They accused Thomas of claiming what did not belong to him, of hoarding wealth while others suffered. Their voices carried the weight of old grievances twisted by desperation. Thomas listened, his jaw set, and told them the truth. The law recognized no inheritance without record, and the only record lay in his possession. They left in anger, but he knew that anger would not fade quickly. One night, he awoke to the sound of footsteps near his porch. He rose silently, rifle in hand, and watched through the cracked shutters as shadows moved across his yard. They lingered near the door, tested the latch, then retreated when they found it locked. His breath slowed only after they vanished into the dark, leaving behind the echo of menace. The farm was no longer a refuge. It had become a battleground where unseen lines were being drawn. Thomas returned to the cave less frequently now, not from lack of will, but from the knowledge that every visit risked discovery. Yet the thought of the gold lying there in silence haunted him. He imagined men creeping through the woods, prying at the brush, stumbling upon the chest. He imagined his chance at salvation vanishing in an instant of careless exposure. Each time he went, he worked quickly, fear driving him more than hope. The struggle was not only with others, but within himself. The wealth tempted him, whispered of freedom from toil, of a life remade. Yet he also feared what it might turn him into, what it had already begun to draw out in those around him. Gold had a way of sharpening greed until it cut through every bond of trust. He saw it in the eyes of neighbors who once greeted him warmly, but now looked with suspicion. He felt it in the shifting air of town, where conversations hushed as he passed. He carried a treasure that changed not only his life, but the world around him. The sheriff visited him after reports of trespassers spread. The lawman, a weary figure hardened by years of disputes, asked pointed questions about whether Thomas had found anything unusual on his property. Thomas deflected with vague words, but the sheriff's gaze lingered, thoughtful and heavy. It was another reminder that secrecy was a fragile shield, one that might break at any moment. Still, Thomas clung to one certainty. The papers gave him ground to stand on. He worked with the lawyer, preparing to file his claim formally. Even as threats grew bolder, he repaired his fences not for livestock, but as barriers against intruders. He kept the rifle near, though his hands shook when he touched it. He felt himself hardening, becoming a man who lived on the edge of vigilance, never at rest. The climax of his struggle came when a group of men, bolder than the rest, forced their way onto his land and into the ravine. Thomas followed them, his heart pounding, to the cave itself. They had torches, their light flickering against the stone, and they shouted that the gold belonged to all, that no single man had the right to claim it. For a moment he stood in the shadows, watching them, the old fear choking him. Then something within him broke free. He stepped forward, his voice ringing in the chamber, telling them the truth. That the gold alone meant nothing. That without the documents, they would have no claim, no protection, no right that the law would recognize. His words carried more force than he expected. The weight of conviction forged in desperation. The men wavered, their anger meeting his resolve. Some spat on the ground and left, muttering curses, but others lingered, eyes narrowed with threat. Thomas knew it was not over. Yet in that moment, standing at the mouth of the cave with the weight of history behind him, he felt a strength he had not known in years. He was no longer a man waiting to lose everything. He was a man fighting for what was his by blood, by labor, and now by law. When he returned to the farmhouse, exhausted but unbroken, he placed the documents back beneath the floorboards with reverent care. The battle was far from finished, but he understood at last what he was truly fighting for. Not merely for gold, not even for the farm alone, but for the right to stand in the world as a man who would not be bent or broken by the greed of others. The cave had tested him, and though the struggle had only begun, he felt within him the steel to endure it. The farm did not change overnight, but in the weeks that followed the confrontation in the cave, a different air seemed to settle upon it. Thomas woke each morning with the same ache in his bones, the same familiar weight of years. Yet there was a quiet fire inside him that had not burned for a long time. He had faced men who wished to take everything from him, and had not faltered. He had held his ground in the darkness of the earth and spoken words that even he had not realized lived within him until the moment demanded them. Now the path lay ahead, narrow and treacherous still, but it was his path, and for the first time in months he believed he could walk it with strength. The lawyer in town pressed his claim forward with deliberate care, each paper signed and notarized, each record examined and compared against county files that had gathered dust for decades. The documents from the chest proved stronger than rumor or intimidation, and the case grew firmer with each passing day. The process was long, filled with delays and technicalities. But the law was slow for everyone, and Thomas found patience where once he had only felt despair. While others muttered in saloons or whispered in the corners of stores about the farmer who had found fortune, Thomas kept his head low, his words few, and his focus steady. In time, the sheriff himself came out to the farm, not with suspicion this time, but with recognition. He told Thomas that the county would uphold the claim, that he would have rights not only to the farm, but to the mineral wealth beneath it. The sheriff spoke plainly, warning that greed would always circle like wolves at the edge of light. But now Thomas had more than shadows to defend him. He had the law, the one thing stronger than fists or whispered threats. Thomas nodded, grateful yet unsentimental. He had learned not to celebrate too soon, but in his chest he felt the old knots begin to loosen. With legal certainty came change. Workmen were hired to survey the land, their voices filling the quiet fields with shouts and laughter as they drove stakes into the ground. Soon equipment arrived, and the ravine echoed not with the cautious steps of trespassers, but with the measured rhythm of legitimate labor. The cave was no longer a secret buried in shadow. It was the foundation of a future. Where once he had crawled alone with a lantern, now men worked in teams, their torches replaced by floodlights, their tools stronger, their movements confident. The mine that had been abandoned was reborn, and Thomas oversaw it not as a laborer, but as an owner. The money that began to flow was not the wild torrent of sudden riches, but it was steady and real, enough to pay every debt that had haunted him, enough to rebuild what time had broken. The farmhouse walls were shored up, the roof repaired until it gleamed in the sunlight once more. The barn was painted red again, the color of his childhood memories. Fences rose straight and tall where they had once sagged, and livestock returned to the pastures, their lowing a music that had been absent for too long. Thomas himself felt the change most deeply in the evenings, when he sat on the porch with the setting sun painting the fields gold. Where once the silence had suffocated him, now it was rich, filled with the hum of insects, the call of birds, and the faint sound of men still working down in the ravine. He looked at the land and saw not only what it had been, but what it would become. He thought of his grandfather, of his father, and imagined their approval in the whisper of the wind through the trees. Yet he did not allow wealth to blind him. He remembered too clearly the faces of those who had come in anger. The trespassers who had believed gold gave them license to threaten and take. He knew that fortune could corrupt a man if he let it. So he held to a simple truth. The land was not only his livelihood, but his responsibility. He treated his workers fairly, paid them promptly, and listened when they spoke of dangers in the tunnels. He rebuilt his farm not as a monument to pride, but as a place that could endure, a place worthy of the generations that had led him here. There were still nights when he woke with the old fear, heart pounding at a sound outside the window. He would rise, step onto the porch, and look across the fields, half expecting to see shadows creeping once more. But the fields were calm, the fences unbroken, and the barn secure. The men who had once threatened him had faded back into their own lives, some out of shame, others out of recognition that the law would not bend to them. Even Edmund Cray, who had led them with such cold determination, had been silenced by charges that bound him more tightly than any rope. The wolves still circled, perhaps, but the light had grown stronger, and Thomas no longer felt alone in the dark. As the months passed, the changes deepened. The mine yielded more than he had dared hope, its veins rich and steady. His farm, once a place of silence and despair, became lively again. Wagons came and went, workers' children played near the fence lines, and laughter returned to the farmhouse when neighbors came by to share in the bounty of the harvest. He had food enough not only for himself, but to share. And in sharing he found the kind of wealth that gold alone could never buy. One evening, as summer ripened, Thomas walked once more down to the ravine. The equipment was quiet now, the men gone for the day, and the cave lay still in the twilight. He stood at its mouth, gazing into the darkness, and felt a strange kinship with it. This place had nearly swallowed him, but it had also given him back his life. It had tested him, stripped him of fear, and demanded that he rise or fall. He laid his hand against the cool stone, remembering the night he had first entered with only a lantern and trembling hands. Now he stood as a man transformed, not by greed, but by resolve, by the courage to claim what was his, and to protect it. The farm stretched wide before him when he returned to the porch, the fields glowing in the last light of day. He knew there would be more struggles ahead, that fortune was never free from burden. But he no longer saw the future as a wall closing in. It opened now, broad and promising, as rich as the soil beneath his boots. He had been given a second chance, not by luck alone, but by the will to endure when all seemed lost. As night fell, and the stars began to kindle in the dark, Thomas sat quietly, listening to the land breathe around him. The debt was gone, the fear diminished, and the house that had once seemed a tomb now felt alive again. He thought of the cave not as a place of darkness, but as a threshold he had crossed from despair into hope, from defeat into renewal. The farm, the mine, and the future stretched together in his mind, woven into one truth. That life, like the land, yielded its riches only to those willing to dig deep and face the shadows. And so he rested at last, not as a man broken by hardship, but as one remade by struggle, ready to live the years ahead with the steadiness of stone and the quiet fire of the earth itself burning within him. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next tale that could change the way you see the world. Click on the video that's on your screen to uncover another shocking story and explore for even more unbelievable discoveries and life-changing moments. And if this video kept you hooked, share it with your friends and family. You never know who else needs to hear a story like this today.